Maybe you could give us, CP, a little primer on what this means, the inverted yield curve, and why people are talking about it this week.
Well, I think people, were talking about it. The reason they were is that they believe that it predicts a recession. And specifically what they look at is the interest rate on a 2-year bond and an interest rate on a 10-year bond, and you subtract one from the other. And when it inverts, what it means is that, typically in a healthy economy, you want rising interest rates over a long period of time. And the reason you would want that is that you are guessing that the economy will be healthy. There'll be a nominal amount of inflation, so things will tentatively increase in price. And as a result of that, you need to get paid more for the future than today, right? So if you want me to take 10-year risk, you need to pay me a little bit more than if you want me to take 2-year risk. And so things should go up and to the right. But when all of that stuff 10 years out, all of a sudden is trading for a lower yield than today, what people think will happen is that, governments will cut interest rates massively. They tend to do that in order to stimulate the economy, right? To get money back into the system. And they tend to do that because of a recession. And so people look at the difference between the 2-year bond and the 10-year bond, and they try to guess what's going to happen. Here's the problem with all of this. It turns out that it's not as correlated as one thinks. And Nick, I posted this link, so you can just put it up there. But a bunch of economists at the Fed actually went and, you have access to this data. They back tested this. And what they found was that there was actually a more predictive signal of recessions, which is the difference between the 3-month T-bill and the 18-month T-bill. And if you look at the 3s18 spread, they call that the forward spread at the Fed. That's actually not showing a recession at all. In fact, that shows a very healthy ascent, largely taking into account the fact that the Fed has told us that they're going to rip in a bunch of rate increases over the next year to 18 months. So what are we to do with all of this? Well, when there's been a recession, it has typically been true that both the 2s, 10s, and the forward spread have collapsed to zero or gone negative. That's this inversion. It has never really been the case that 2s, 10s inverts while the forward spread stays up and you have a recession. In the past, we've mentioned that when oil has these kinds of price spikes, it typically forecasts a recession. So if you put all of this data together, it's a really murky picture. So what are you supposed to do? It's not totally clear to me. But I think the general way that I think the market is reacting to this is probably inappropriate, and I'll tell you why. And the setup, by the way, because of this inappropriateness is actually quite interesting. So why is the reaction inappropriate? Look, if you think about where we were in November and where we are today, almost April 1st, right? So it's been 4 months, 5 months. We've had massive exposition of inflation. We've had massive disruptions to the supply chain. We've had the beginning of a war whose end is somewhat indeterminate today. That's causing a bunch of spikes in a bunch of really critical commodities the entire world needs. We've had a Federal Reserve that went from hiking 50 or 75 basis points to hiking 200 to 250 basis points by the estimated average. And so all of these things have happened, yet the market is basically at an all-time high, plus or minus at 5%. That really doesn't hang together at some really basic logical level, right? So what's going to happen? Well, Brad said this last week. What has actually happened under the hood is a dispersion, which means the crappy companies have gotten crushed and the good companies have gotten whacked, but not crushed. Okay? And then when they rally disproportionately in favor of the good companies. So what are we doing right now? I think we are going to see this diversion of companies, and we're about to go through earnings season, right? We're at the end of Q1. And I think what's going to happen is really interesting. You're going to have a handful of companies who have a great handle on their business, who actually project strength. I know what I'm doing. I know how I'm going to perform. The levers are in my control. I'm going to invest for the future. I'm going to go and consolidate a market. Those companies will get rewarded. And then anybody else who has a whiff of indecision or whose structural business is flawed and then they use all of these other issues as a reason to explain their flawed business, will get completely whacked. 2 examples over this last week, and we had this debate. People were talking about restoration hardware and the CEO basically saying the sky is falling and there's a huge recession. And, my comment is, well, if you take the other side of the coin, restoration hardware sells overpriced, crappy furniture into a housing market that's basically shut down because refi rates are at 5%. There's the other explanation for why his business is crappy. It doesn't necessarily have to be a recession.
Well, and just to clearly define it, a recession is 2 quarters or more of negative growth, the economy contracting. And we've had about a dozen of these since World War II. We remember a couple of them in our lifetimes. Obviously, the COVID situation created a recession for a couple of quarters. And then we had the Great Recession, which lasted, I think that was over a year, right? That was 6 quarters, I think, 5 quarters. So these happen every 10 years or so. So if we do have a recession, and it seems implausible to me that we would have negative growth for 2 quarters. So,
well, the other interesting company, for example, was UiPath, which UiPath got whacked today 25 or 26%. And what they actually reported was that they thought that they were going to increase ARR to 1.2 billion from like 900. That's a huge, at that scale, to grow 35-40% in ARR in a year is really quite incredible. But their ACV numbers and their revenue numbers were a little soft. They got whacked. And now they're trading, like 11 times ARR. So you have some of these companies that are going to blame macro headwinds, but they may actually just have a flawed business model. You'll have these other companies who actually overperform, but may have been a little bit too highly valued, who'll get valuation reset on any faint weakness. And so, it's going to be really up to these CEOs and these boards when they write their earnings releases to be very precise. Those that have a handle on their business, I think, are going to get really rewarded. And those that don't need to blame the macro market and just get all the bad news out now, because this is the quarter. It doesn't get any better from here.